My name is Renata Callahan, and I'm 51 years old. 6 months ago, I stood outside the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, and listened to my former mother-in-law scream at me in front of a dozen strangers walking to their cars. Doreen Kessler planted the rubber tip of her cane on the pavement like she was staking a claim, and her voice carried far enough that a young couple crossing the parking lot actually stopped to stare. "Don't you ever set foot in my house again," she said. "Get out and don't come back." Behind her, my ex-husband Preston stood with his arms folded across his gray suit jacket, the same smug half-smile he used to wear when a big client signed a contract. He looked like a man who believed he had just won something enormous. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, and I felt the familiar throb behind my right eye that always showed up when I hadn't slept enough the night before. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do, though I had thought about it more times than I could count over the past few months. I smiled at her. "Actually, Doreen," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet enough that she had to lean in slightly to hear me. "The sale closed this morning." She blinked at me, confused, the way people do when the words don't fit the sentence they were expecting. "What sale?" she snapped. "I sold the house," I told her. "And your son isn't the CEO of Kessler Machine Works anymore." For 2 full seconds, nobody on those courthouse steps said a single word. I could hear traffic somewhere behind us on Main Street, and the distant clang of a delivery truck backing into an alley, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world kept making its ordinary noises, while my entire life quietly rearranged itself in front of 3 people who had spent years believing they understood exactly who I was. Then Preston laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh either. It was loud and confident, the kind of laugh that turns a few heads on a public sidewalk, and it made my stomach tighten in a way I hadn't expected. "Renata," he said, shaking his head as I'd just told a joke at a dinner party. "You have always had quite an imagination." Doreen laughed right along with him, tilting her chin up in that way she had perfected over 25 years of looking down at me. "You honestly expect anyone to believe that," she said. I didn't answer her right away. There was nothing left to explain to either of them. Not yet, not standing on a sidewalk with a migraine building behind my eye, and a folder of legal paperwork tucked under my arm. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope and held it out toward her. "These are the instructions from my attorney," I said. "You have 72 hours to remove your personal belongings from the property." She didn't even reach for it. She just stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. Preston stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the same cologne he'd worn since we were in our 30s, and his voice dropped into something sharper. "You have officially lost your mind," he said. Maybe he actually believed that, or maybe he needed to believe it, because if he let himself consider for even a second that I wasn't bluffing, then everything he had assumed about the last 25 years of his life was about to come apart in his hands. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I think a lot of you watching this have had a version of it in your own lives. The moment when someone who has underestimated you for years finally realizes they were wrong, and they realize it too late to do anything about it. If that has ever happened to you, or if you're bracing for a moment like that right now, I want you to drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from, because I read every single one, and this story is for you. And if this kind of story is the kind that keeps you company, go ahead and subscribe now, because what happened in the 6 months before I stood on those steps is going to explain exactly why I was smiling. 6 months earlier, I never imagined I would be the one standing outside a courthouse saying words like that to a woman I had spent decades trying to please. Back then, I was still trying to hold together a marriage that had quietly ended years before I let myself admit it. People always assume a marriage dies in one dramatic moment: a slammed door, a screaming match, a single unforgivable sentence. In my experience, it dies in hundreds of small ones, so small you can talk yourself out of noticing them for a very long time. It was Preston stopping by my office only when he needed a signature on something. It was 3 nights a week of eating dinner alone, because another meeting had run long. It was watching him introduce himself at company dinners and industry events without ever once mentioning my name, as if I were simply a piece of furniture that happened to be standing beside him. The worst instance of that happened at an awards dinner downtown, the kind with a rented ballroom and a string of speeches nobody really listens to. Kessler Machine Works had just been recognized for 25 years in business, a milestone I had spent 2.5 decades keeping alive through recessions and layoffs, and years where I genuinely did not know if we would make payroll. I sat at our table wearing a dark green dress I had owned for almost 10 years, nothing fancy, because I had never been the kind of person who needed to be fancy. Preston walked up onto that stage looking completely at ease, like a man who had rehearsed every word in front of a mirror. "I started this company with nothing but a dream," he told the room, and people applauded warmly. "I have worked every single day to build it into what it is today," he said, and the applause grew louder. I sat there waiting for him to mention the people who had actually kept the doors open, the employees, his late father who had given us our first loan, or maybe, just maybe, me. "Thank you all for believing in my vision," he said, and that was it. That was the entire speech. I smiled politely, because everyone else in that ballroom was smiling, and clapping felt like the only acceptable response in a room full of people who had no idea what the truth actually was. But something inside me quietly cracked that night. Not loudly, not visibly, just a hairline fracture that would only widen with time. It wasn't that I needed applause for myself. It was that I had spent 25 years making certain payroll cleared every single Friday, that I had personally refinanced our home during the worst months of the recession, that I had called suppliers myself, one by one, and begged for another 30 days when our cash flow nearly collapsed entirely. And it was that I remembered, with a clarity that still catches in my throat, my father quietly sliding a folded check across our kitchen table, back when the company was barely more than a rented garage and a stack of unpaid invoices. He had sold part of his land to make that check possible, everything he had saved after my mother passed away, and he had looked at me and said only one thing: "If you believe this company can survive, then so do I." That money hadn't bought us anything luxurious. It had bought us time, and over 25 years, that time had quietly become the very company Preston now stood on a stage calling entirely his own. A few weeks after that awards dinner, I noticed something small that I tried very hard to explain away. Preston had stopped wearing his wedding ring, not all the time, only when he traveled for business, only when he was heading out the door with his roller bag and his laptop case slung over one shoulder. I told myself it was because of airport security, or because his fingers swelled on long flights, or a dozen other harmless little reasons I kept feeding myself like they were vitamins. By then, silence had become so much easier than confrontation that I chose it without even fully realizing I was choosing anything at all. I had built an entire second career out of not asking questions I was afraid to hear the answers to. Then one Tuesday evening in early spring, he walked into the kitchen carrying a manila folder while I was heating up leftover chicken soup, because my head had been pounding since noon, and cooking anything more complicated felt impossible. He set the folder down on the counter right beside my bowl, without saying a word first, and something in the way he did it, careful, deliberate, already resolved, made my stomach drop before I even opened it. "I've already signed," he said. I looked down and saw divorce papers sitting there, his signature already dried on the line, waiting for mine like it was simply the next item on a checklist. There had been no warning conversation, no late-night talk about where we stood, nothing, just a folder beside a bowl of soup on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. "I think this is best," he said, and his voice sounded almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. I kept staring at the papers because I genuinely did not know what else to do with my eyes. "What happened to us?" I finally asked him, and he let out this small, impatient sigh, the kind you give a child who is asking a question you've already answered. "Renata, we've been roommates for years," he said. I nodded slowly, because honestly, some part of that felt true. "But roommates don't erase each other," I told him, And I meant it more than I think he understood in that moment. He leaned back against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, completely composed, like this was any other business decision he'd made 100 times before. "I've already talked with my attorney," he said. And of course he had. Of course there was already a plan in motion that I knew nothing about. "I'll make sure you're comfortable financially," he added. And that word, comfortable, landed on me like a slap disguised as kindness. Comfortable. After 25 years of building something together with my own two hands. I finally looked up and asked him the one question I truly needed an answer to. "What do you think I contributed to this company, Preston?" I said, and he actually looked surprised, like the question had never once occurred to him in all our years together. "You handled spreadsheets," he said. 4 words. That was his entire answer to 25 years. Nothing about the loans I had personally negotiated with 3 different banks when we needed to expand the second facility. Nothing about the health insurance I had fought to keep for every single employee during a year when premiums nearly doubled overnight. Nothing about the nights I had sat beside hospital beds after workplace accidents, holding the hands of people whose families didn't know if they could pay their bills that month. Nothing about the vacations I had quietly canceled year after year because someone always had to stay behind and keep the lights on. "You handled spreadsheets." That was it. That was how the man I had spent half my life beside had summarized me. He picked up his keys off the counter a moment later and told me he had dinner plans with Natalie, though he didn't actually say her name out loud. He just let the sentence trail off in a way that made it clear he assumed I already knew exactly who Natalie was and what she meant. And the terrible thing is, I did know. Some part of me had known for a while, and simply hadn't let myself say it out loud. The same way you know a storm is coming from the color of the sky, long before the first drop of rain ever falls. After the front door closed behind him, I sat alone at that kitchen counter until the soup went completely cold in the bowl. I wasn't crying yet. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect tears in a moment like that, and what I actually felt was something closer to confusion. A slow and disorienting attempt to understand how a person could stand beside me for 25 years, could watch me build a company from a rented garage into something worth millions, and still genuinely believe, all that time, that I had simply been organizing paperwork. I sat there long enough that the kitchen clock ticked past 11, and I remember looking around at that house, the house we had bought together in our 30s when we could barely afford the down payment, and thinking about how many decisions had been made inside those walls that I had no idea about until they were already finished. The divorce, I would learn later, was not the first document Preston had already signed without telling me. It was simply the one he finally let me see. And somewhere in that quiet, cold kitchen, staring at a bowl of soup I never finished, I decided without fully knowing yet what shape it would take. I decided I was done being the woman who found things out last. 2 days later, I met with a woman named Marla Whitfield, who had served on our board for nearly a decade, and had become one of the only people I trusted without reservation. We sat at a small coffee shop near the university, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and I told her everything. The folder on the counter, the cold soup, the 4 words that had summarized 25 years of my life. She listened without interrupting once, and when I finally finished, she stirred her coffee slowly and asked me a question I did not expect. "What do you want, Renata?" she said. I told her I didn't know. "Yes, you do," she said gently, and I looked out the window at the traffic passing by before I finally admitted it out loud. "I want him to stop pretending I never existed," I told her, and she nodded like that was exactly the answer she'd been waiting for. Then she asked me something that had absolutely nothing to do with the conversation we had just been having, and it caught me completely off guard. "Did you sign this year's shareholder proxy?" she asked. I blinked at her, confused, because I honestly could not even remember the last time I had thought about that piece of paper. "No, I haven't," I said. "I forgot." She smiled at me then, the first real smile I had seen from her that morning, and told me that I hadn't forgotten at all, that some part of me had simply held on to it exactly when I needed to. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick corporate binder, the kind with tabs and dividers, and slid it across the table toward me, with a kind of quiet ceremony. "Turn to page 32, she said. I frowned and did as she asked, and what I saw wasn't dramatic on the surface at all. No bold headlines, no highlighted clause, just a chart full of names and numbers, and the kind of dense corporate language I had spent half my career learning to read. I told her I didn't understand what I was looking at, and she leaned forward and tapped the page once with her finger. "You own 38% of the company's equity," she said, and I told her I already knew that. "But that isn't what matters here," she said, and pointed lower on the page. "Your Class A preferred shares carry 5 votes each." I nodded slowly, because I remembered, distantly, that my father had insisted on exactly that arrangement back when the company was still nothing more than a garage full of borrowed equipment. "So do I," Marla said, and then she said something that stopped me cold. "Preston remembers too." I told her I had assumed she was about to say he'd forgotten, and she shook her head. "No, that would make this story too easy," she said, and then she smiled faintly and told me the truth of it. "He didn't forget, Renata. He got comfortable." That sentence stayed with me long after we left the coffee shop that day. For years, every single annual shareholders meeting had followed the same quiet routine. A few weeks beforehand, Preston's assistant would email me a proxy authorization form. I would sign it without much thought. He would vote my shares alongside his, and life would simply continue without incident. I trusted him, I told Marla, and she nodded and said that over time, he had come to believe that trust was permanent, something he no longer had to earn, or even think about, simply a fact of his life, the way the sun rising in the morning was a fact. She slid one more document across the table. This year's proxy authorization. Blank, completely unsigned, still sitting unopened in a folder I hadn't touched. "I never sent it back," I told her, and she looked at me directly and said that for the first time in 17 years, Preston did not control my votes. I sat there in silence, listening to a delivery truck backing into the alley behind the shop, someone laughing near the counter, life going on exactly as it always had, while mine had just quietly, invisibly, shifted beneath my feet. Around that same time, things at home had already begun to change, in ways I could feel before I could fully name them. Doreen had started acting as though I no longer lived in the house at all. One Thursday afternoon, I came home from a doctor's appointment about the arthritis that had been flaring up in 2 fingers of my right hand, and when I stepped through the front door, I found cardboard boxes stacked in the entryway, one of them labeled in thick black marker, with the word "donate" written twice for emphasis. I knelt carefully and opened it, and on top sat my parents' wedding photograph. Beneath it was my father's old pocket knife, my mother's handwritten recipe cards, and an album full of photographs from the very first years of Kessler Machine Works, Preston covered in machine grease in our old rented garage, me holding our daughter with one arm while answering payroll calls with the other. One photograph had been bent sharply across the corner, and I sat there on the floor and gently smoothed it back into place with my thumb. Doreen walked in a moment later, carrying grocery bags, and when she saw me kneeling there, she didn't look embarrassed at all. "I figured Preston wouldn't want all that old clutter lying around," she said, and I looked up at her and told her that my parents were not clutter. She sighed dramatically, the way she always did when she felt I was being difficult, and told me not to start, that I would be moving out soon anyway, and there was no reason to drag around useless old memories forever. I closed the album carefully and told her that those weren't just memories to me. They were proof that I had been there from the very beginning of everything this family had built. That evening, while I was carrying laundry up the stairs, I overheard her on the phone, clearly unaware that I was home yet. "I told Natalie she's going to love this kitchen once they finally remodel it," she was saying, and then a pause, and then a laugh, and then something about how ancient the cabinets were, and how they'd finally make the house look modern again. I quietly walked back downstairs before she noticed me standing there, not because I was afraid of her, but because I had just fully understood something for the very first time. She wasn't imagining a future where I still existed at all. The following Monday, my phone rang while I was standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I hadn't gotten around to drinking yet. It was Curtis Halloway, our outside accountant, and he rarely called me directly, so I felt my stomach tighten a little before I even answered. "Renata," he said, and his voice sounded unusually serious for a man who was normally all easy small talk and weather updates before getting to business. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked, and something about his tone made me sit down at the kitchen table without even meaning to. I told him I did. "I've been reviewing executive compensation," he said, "and I found several things Marla is going to need to see." I asked him what kind of things, and he lowered his voice like he was worried the walls might be listening. "Large executive retention bonuses," he said, and I told him that wasn't necessarily unusual for a company our size. "These were approved without full board review," he said, and I felt my grip tighten around the phone. He told me there was more. A resort trip in Aspen, listed on the books as a vendor conference, only there was no record of a single scheduled vendor meeting anywhere in the documentation. Just one hotel room reserved for the entire stay. I didn't need him to say a name out loud for me to understand exactly whose room that was. He kept going, explaining that retirement contributions for hourly employees had been quietly scaled back at the same time executive bonuses had climbed, and that several accounting classifications simply did not add up the way they should have. Nothing on its own screamed criminal, he said carefully, but together the whole picture looked bad, the kind of bad that a board of directors could not simply pretend not to see once it was placed in front of them. When we hung up, I sat alone in that kitchen for nearly 20 minutes without moving, and I want to be honest with you, I wasn't thinking about revenge in that moment at all. I was thinking about Walter Greaves, a man who had worked for our company since the very earliest garage days, 68 years old and still showing up before sunrise every single morning without fail. If Preston had really chosen bonuses for people like Natalie over the retirement security of people like Walter, then this had already stopped being about my marriage. This was about something much bigger than the two of us. That evening, our daughter Elise came over and stood in my kitchen twisting her coffee mug between both hands, clearly working up the courage to say something. "Mom," she finally said, and I looked at her and told her I already knew. "Knew what exactly?" she asked, and I said about Natalie, and the words seemed to barely make it out of her mouth. "For almost a year," she said, and the room went completely quiet around us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked her, and she started crying, telling me that her father had said I already knew, that our marriage had been over for years already, that staying neutral had felt like the only way she could avoid choosing sides in something that was already broken beyond repair. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand and told her that sometimes silence chooses for you whether you mean it to or not, and she just nodded, because some part of her clearly already understood exactly what I meant. The next morning, my phone rang again before 8 o'clock. It was Marla. "Curtis finished reviewing everything," she said, and I held my breath waiting for the rest of the sentence. "We have enough," she told me, and I asked her, "Enough for what, exactly?" "An emergency board meeting," she said, and I asked her when. "Tomorrow," she said, and then a pause just long enough for my stomach to knot up all over again. 10 o'clock. I barely slept the night before that meeting, not because I was afraid of Preston anymore, but because I was afraid of myself, afraid of what kind of person I was about to become in that boardroom. At 51 years old, you stop believing that every difficult decision comes with a clean, satisfying ending. I had spent 25 years helping build that company. I knew every hallway, every machine on the production floor, every employee's birthday, and every family emergency we had quietly helped them through over the years. What if removing Preston hurt the very people I was trying to protect? That question followed me all the way to sunrise, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee I never actually drank, watching the sky slowly turn gray outside the window and wondering if I was about to do the right thing, or simply the angry one. Around 7:30 that morning, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was Marla. "I know what you're thinking," she said, before I had even fully said hello, and I asked her if she really did. "You're wondering whether this is becoming personal," she said, and I looked out the kitchen window at the old maple tree my father had planted the year Elise was born, its branches heavy with early spring leaves, and I told her the truth. "It is personal," I said. She didn't argue with me. "But that doesn't make it wrong," she said, and I stayed quiet, letting that settle over me. "If Curtis's report had come back clean," she went on, "I would be telling you to walk away from all of this right now. And if it isn't clean, then your responsibility isn't to Preston anymore, it's to the company itself." An hour later, I drove to the office, and the familiar Kessler Machine Works sign came into view through my windshield. And for a moment, I let myself remember the very first building we had ever rented. 8,000 square feet, one loading dock, one coffee maker that never worked properly no matter how many times we replaced it. Back then, Preston and I had celebrated every single new customer with cheap takeout pizza eaten straight out of the box. We hadn't been competing with each other in those days. We had simply been trying to survive together. That memory almost made me turn the car around right there in the parking lot. Almost. When I walked into the lobby, everything seemed completely normal, which somehow felt strange given what I knew was about to happen upstairs. Someone laughed near the vending machines. Forklift alarms echoed faintly from somewhere out on the production floor. The receptionist answered phones exactly like she did every single morning of the year. Nobody down there had any idea what was coming, and I remember hoping, genuinely hoping, that most of them never would. Not the details of it, at least. Companies can survive bad leadership. What they can't always survive is constant, public, humiliating drama playing out in front of everyone who depends on that paycheck. I took the elevator up to the executive floor, where Marla and Curtis were already waiting for me. Curtis looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept much better than I had. "I reviewed everything twice," he told me quietly. "You won't find any mistakes in it." I told him I never thought I would. "I wish I had," he said, and I understood exactly what he meant by that. Marla handed me a folder and told me this wasn't my fight unless I decided to make it mine, and I appreciated that more than she probably realized, because nobody in that room was pushing me toward anything or promising me some sweet taste of revenge. They were simply offering accountability, plain and unglamorous, which somehow felt like the most honest thing anyone had offered me in months. At around 9:10, another board member arrived, a man named Wendell Cross who had served alongside Marla for nearly as many years. He greeted me politely and told me he hadn't expected to see me there that morning. I imagine Preston wasn't expecting it either, I told him, and he gave a small, uncomfortable smile and admitted that mixing a divorce with corporate governance made him uneasy. "So am I told him honestly. "I don't want revenge, Wendell," I said, and he asked me then why exactly we were all sitting there. I looked him directly in the eye and told him that if Curtis's report had been about anyone else in that building, we would still be having this exact meeting without a single ounce of hesitation. He sat with that for a long moment before finally nodding, not agreement exactly, but not dismissal either. At 9:40, my attorney called with news that made my chest go tight. "The judge signed the settlement," he told me, and I closed my eyes right there in that conference room. "So it's official?" I asked him, and he confirmed it was. "And the house?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The title company has full authorization to close," he told me, and I whispered a quiet thank you before the call ended. I sat there staring at my phone for a long moment, because for the first time in months, I let myself take one slow, full breath. Preston had insisted, all through mediation, on keeping the downtown condominium, the bulk of our brokerage account, and his boat, calling my parents' old house nothing more than a money pit not worth his time. He had wanted liquidity, he had wanted convenience, and he had laughed openly when his own attorney suggested he think twice before signing away his claim to it. Then, right at 10 o'clock, another email arrived, a routine shareholder proxy authorization request from Preston's assistant, formatted exactly the way it had been formatted every single year for the past 17 years. "Please sign at your earliest convenience," it read, and I almost laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because habit is a powerful and dangerous thing. For 17 years, I would have opened that attachment without thinking twice and signed it away. My hand actually reached for the mouse before I stopped myself cold, looked at the date, and realized it had been sent on the exact morning of a 10 o'clock board meeting he had absolutely no idea was even happening. At exactly 10 o'clock, Preston walked into the boardroom, wearing that same confident smile, coffee in one hand, moving like a man who had never once questioned his own place in that building. "Morning, everyone," he said, glancing around the table before his eyes landed on me, and his smile faltered just slightly. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and I told him I had been invited. "This is a board meeting," he said, and Marla closed the leather folder in front of her calmly and told him yes, it was exactly that. "So why is Renata sitting here?" he asked, and Marla answered without a hint of hesitation in her voice. "Because she's a director and a voting shareholder," she said, and Preston blinked, shrugged, and told everyone, "Let's just get this over with then." He sat down at the opposite end of the table from me, and I noticed Natalie wasn't in the room. She was waiting somewhere outside, likely expecting him to walk out later and introduce her to everyone as the company's new chief operating officer. Marla looked around the table and asked everyone to confirm they had received Curtis's audit summary ahead of time, and papers rustled quietly as heads nodded one by one. Preston looked genuinely irritated. "What audit?" he asked, and Curtis slid a folder across the table toward him and told him he'd want to start with page 4. Preston flipped through the first few pages, and I watched his expression shift in real time. "What is this?" he demanded, and Marla told him calmly that it was simply their agenda for the morning. Executive compensation, conflict of interest, travel reimbursement, unauthorized bonus approvals. The room went completely quiet, quiet enough that the hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded loud. Preston looked directly at me across that long table. "This is because of the divorce," he said, and Marla cut in gently before I could even respond. "No," she said. "This meeting is about corporate governance. Nothing more and nothing less." Preston leaned back in his chair, clearly stunned, and told the room he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Curtis cleared his throat and addressed him directly. "Mr. Kessler," he said, and Preston snapped that they were unauthorized. "Perhaps," Curtis said evenly, "but they weren't properly disclosed either." Preston turned to me again, his voice hardening. "You planned this," he said, and I met his eyes without flinching. "I planned to tell the truth," I told him. "You're willing to destroy this company because I left you," he said, and for one brief moment, the room around me seemed to disappear entirely, and I was standing back in that rented garage 25 years earlier, both of us covered in machine grease, laughing over cold pizza because we had just landed our very first big contract together. Then I came back to the present, to the man sitting across from me now, and I told him no. "I'm trying to stop you from destroying the company we built," I said, "not the company you built." Nobody in that room said a word after that. Marla looked around the table and said the board would now formally review the motion concerning executive leadership, and she placed a printed resolution in front of every single director. Wendell hesitated for a long moment when it came time to vote, long enough that I genuinely thought he might side with Preston. Instead, slowly, he raised his hand. Marla counted the votes quietly, then looked directly at Preston. "The motion passes," she said. "Effective immediately, you're removed as Chief Executive Officer of Kessler Machine Works." There was no applause, no dramatic music playing somewhere in the background, just silence, thick and absolute. Preston remained standing, his face pale in a way I had never seen before in all our years together. "You can't do this," he said, and Marla folded the signed resolution and told him quietly that they already had. She slid the document toward me next, and told me she needed one more signature to certify it as a shareholder. My fingers ached as I picked up the pen, the arthritis in my right hand choosing that exact moment to make itself known, and I almost smiled at the strange timing of it all. I signed my name, not out of revenge, but because I wanted the record to finally reflect the truth. Preston stared at that signature as it belonged to a stranger. 25 years reduced to a single line of ink. A moment later, a facilities manager who had worked with our company for nearly 15 years knocked softly on the open door. "Mr. Kessler," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "Whenever you're ready, I'll help you gather your personal belongings." Not security officers walking him out, not a scene of any kind, just a man doing his job the way he always had. Somehow that made the whole thing sadder than if it had been dramatic. Less than an hour later, I walked out of that building alone, and the summer air outside felt warmer than I had expected it to. I thought I would feel triumphant, but instead I felt deeply, profoundly tired. My phone rang before I even made it to my car. It was my attorney again. "Renata, is everything all right?" he asked, and I told him the closing was complete. "So it's official?" I asked, and he confirmed that Delia Marsh, the buyer, now legally owned my parents' old property. I thanked him and ended the call, then sat in my car for several minutes without turning the key. I had imagined this exact moment dozens of times over the past several months, and I had always assumed I would feel victorious when it finally arrived. Instead, I found myself missing my father, wishing more than anything that he could have seen the little house he had loved so much still standing, still whole, instead of being torn down for something newer. Delia had promised to restore it, not replace it, and I knew, somehow, that he would have liked that very much. I drove out to my parents' old house, because I had left one last box of personal things behind, and I wanted to collect it before the property officially changed hands. When I pulled onto that quiet street, another car was already parked outside, and Delia Marsh stood talking with her realtor near the front walk, both of them smiling politely when they noticed me getting out of my car. Then a second car pulled up behind mine. Preston. He climbed out without saying a single word. A minute later, the front door opened, and Doreen appeared on the porch, spotting me immediately, her face hardening in that familiar way I had seen so many times over 25 years. She made her way toward me as quickly as her knees would carry her, cane clicking against the concrete steps, and then she planted that cane directly across the walkway like a barricade. "Don't you ever set foot in my house again," she said, loud enough that a couple of neighbors glanced over from their own yards. She didn't seem to care at all who was watching. "Get out," she said again, sharper this time. I took one slow breath before I answered her. "Actually, Doreen," I said quietly, and she folded her arms, waiting. "The sale closed this morning," I told her. "What?" she said, her voice suddenly less certain. "I sold the house," I repeated, and this time I let the second part follow right behind it. "And Preston isn't the CEO anymore." She let out a short laugh, the same dismissive sound she'd made outside the courthouse weeks earlier, and told me that no, that simply couldn't be true. Then she looked toward her son, waiting for him to correct me, to laugh along with her the way he always used to. Preston said nothing at all. For the very first time since I had known him, he genuinely could not find the words. Delia stepped forward quietly then, and introduced herself. "Mrs. Kessler," she said gently. "I'm Delia Marsh. I'm the new owner of this property." She held out a folder toward Doreen, who ignored it completely, refusing even to look in that direction. "This is my son's house," Doreen said. And Delia, without arguing, simply opened the folder to the final page and turned it toward her. Preston's signature sat right there beside the settlement agreement and the closing confirmation. Doreen grabbed the papers herself, then, her eyes scanning from one line to the next, and then she turned to look at her son. "You signed this?" she asked him, and Preston rubbed the back of his neck and admitted quietly that he hadn't really thought it through at the time. "No," she interrupted him sharply. "You didn't." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, and for just a moment, she looked far older than 74, standing there on that porch with paint samples still tucked under one arm. White, gray, and cream. Samples for a kitchen remodel she had clearly already been planning in her head. A patrol car pulled up to the curb not long after that, one of the neighbors having apparently called after hearing the raised voices carry down the street. The deputy listened patiently while everyone explained the situation, reviewed the paperwork Delia handed him, and then handed it back without a hint of drama in his tone. "Ma'am," he told Doreen gently, "the property legally changed ownership this morning." He wasn't rude about it at all. He simply explained that the settlement agreement gave her 72 hours to remove her personal belongings, nothing more and nothing less. Delia offered quietly that she had already arranged movers, if Doreen needed any help with that, and Doreen didn't respond to her at all. She was still staring at her son. I picked up the last cardboard box from just inside the front hallway, and as I walked back toward my car, Preston followed a few steps behind me. "Renata," he said, and I stopped walking. "Please," he said, and something in his voice had shifted entirely, the confidence completely gone from it now. "I need you to fix this," he said. "Fix what?" I asked him. "This whole thing with the board," he said. "You still have influence there." I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "I don't want your marriage back," I told him, and he said he knew that already. "I want my job," he said, and I believed him completely. And honestly, that hurt more than almost anything else he had said to me in the past several months, because it told me he still hadn't understood what he had actually lost. "I can't help you with that," I told him. "You could," he said, "if you wanted to." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. He lowered his voice even further. "I'm asking you," he said, and I told him quietly that I was asking for something too. "For what?" he asked. "Respect," I said. He looked away from me then, out toward the street, and didn't say anything else. I climbed into my car without waiting for a response, because at that point, I genuinely didn't need one anymore. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived in my mailbox for the Kessler Machine Works annual Employee Appreciation Banquet, the kind of formal card I would have thrown away without a second thought if I hadn't noticed one handwritten line at the bottom. "Please come," it read, signed simply, Marla. When I walked into the ballroom at the downtown convention center that evening, the first person I saw was Preston, standing alone near the back wall in a charcoal suit, not seated at the head table, not surrounded by executives the way he always used to be, just standing there quietly by himself. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving before anyone noticed me, because I wasn't interested in another confrontation. Marla spotted me first. "I'm glad you came," she said, and I told her I had almost decided not to. "I figured," she said, glancing toward Preston. "He insisted on attending tonight." "You let him?" I asked. "He's still a shareholder," she reminded me gently, "but tonight isn't about him." I told her I hoped that was true, and she touched my arm and asked me for one favor. "Just stay until the end," she said, and I told her I wasn't sure I could. "You can," she said, and something in her certainty reminded me of what my father used to tell me whenever I doubted myself. "You don't have to enjoy doing the hard thing, you just have to do it." Dinner passed quietly enough. People I had worked beside for decades stopped by my table to say hello, some retired years ago now, but still showing up every summer, because that company had genuinely felt like a second family to so many of them. Walter Greaves eventually sat down beside me, looking older than the last time I had seen him, his hair almost entirely white now, but his smile completely unchanged. "Good to see you, kid," he said, the same way he had been calling me kid since I was in my 20s. I told him I had missed him. "You look tired," he said, and I admitted that I was. "You'll sleep better soon," he told me, and I hoped he was right. He nodded toward the empty stage and told me I was going to like what happened tonight, and when I asked him what he meant, he only smiled and told me I would see. After dessert, Marla stepped up onto the stage, and the conversations around the room gradually quieted down. She thanked everyone for another successful year, then began talking about the company's 25-year history, and a large screen behind her lit up with an old photograph of that same rented garage, Preston at 28 grinning beside our first used milling machine. Another photograph followed, me sitting on a folding chair with a calculator, invoices spread out across a card table in front of me. The next one made me laugh out loud through unexpected tears. Elise as a toddler asleep inside a cardboard box while I finished processing that week's payroll beside her. Another slide showed my father standing proudly next to the very first machine his investment had allowed us to buy. My throat tightened as I watched it all pass by. For many years, Marla said, our company history recognized only one founder. She paused, letting that sit in the air. That history was incomplete, she said, and the next slide appeared with a single simple title, Founders, and beneath it, Preston Kessler and Renata Whitmore Kessler. The room went completely still. Some people build companies by making sales, she said, looking around the ballroom. Others build companies by making sure every employee gets paid, every supplier gets called, every problem gets solved before anyone else even notices. She smiled and told everyone that tonight, they were simply correcting the record. I heard a chair scrape softly against the floor as someone stood, then another, until nearly the entire room was on its feet. Walter was already standing, and the applause started slowly before growing louder and louder, and I looked around at people I had hired, people I had comforted after surgeries, people whose children I had watched grow up over the years, some of them smiling, some of them crying, and I found myself doing both at once. Marla motioned toward the stage, and I shook my head, and she smiled and told me yes anyway, and the applause simply refused to stop until I finally stood and made my way forward, my right hand trembling badly enough by the time I reached the microphone that I had to steady it with my left. I told the room I'd had a speech prepared, then admitted through a laugh that wasn't quite true, and the audience laughed warmly along with me. I guess I don't anymore, I said. And then I told them, simply, that I had never wanted recognition, only the truth. This company was never built by one person, I said, looking around at every face in that room, and I thanked them for letting me be part of something so much larger than either Preston or me ever could have built alone. Afterwards, once the room had mostly emptied, Preston walked over and stood facing me one last time. No lawyers, no judges, no board members watching us now, just two people who had once believed they would grow old together. I owe you an apology, he said, and I waited. I should have given you more credit, he told me, and for a moment I almost accepted that as enough. Then I realized credit had never actually been what was missing between us. You should have given me respect, I told him, and he lowered his head and admitted quietly that he understood. He asked me then if I thought I would ever forgive him, and I told him, honestly, that I already had. He looked surprised by that. But forgiveness isn't permission to come back, I added, and he nodded slowly and said he understood that too. Whether he truly did, I still can't say for certain. Elise found me outside a while later, overlooking the water, and wrapped her arms around me without a word. I'm proud of you, she whispered eventually, and I kissed the top of her head and told her I was proud of her too. Life became surprisingly ordinary after that. I bought a small ranch-style home across town, no stairs, a little garden out back, plenty of room for Elise whenever she wanted to visit. I began consulting for smaller manufacturing companies, a few days each month, just enough to stay busy, never enough to lose my weekends to it again. Delia occasionally sent me photographs as she slowly restored my parents' old house, the original hardwood floors preserved, the front porch untouched. Even the kitchen cabinets Doreen had been so determined to replace, kept exactly as they had always been. My father would have smiled at that. A few months later, a handwritten envelope arrived in my mailbox, and the return address surprised me. Doreen. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I was wrong about the house, it read. I was wrong about your place in the company. I don't expect you to answer. I only wanted you to know. Signed, Doreen. I didn't write back right away, But a few weeks later, I sent her a simple card wishing her well. Compassion didn't erase everything that had happened between us, but it meant I no longer wanted to carry bitterness into whatever years I had left. People sometimes ask me now if winning felt as satisfying as I once imagined it would. The truth is, not exactly. What actually healed me wasn't watching Preston lose his title, or selling that old house, or even standing on that stage while a room full of people finally saw me clearly. What healed me was simply believing, at last, that I no longer had to earn respect from people who had already decided, long ago, never to give it to me freely.